Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. I am I'm a pacer in the lecture hall, so you're gonna see me running back and forth to my computer and back because I feel the need to kind of be close to you guys when we're talking. So I hope that we have some conversations today. I want to present a couple different things to you today. First of all, I want to just start with some ideas relating to sustainability, connecting them to living buildings, and to kind of get a sense of some of the opportunities that are out there. Then I'm going to take you through two projects. One is a living building project that Mike mentioned we're working on, the Phipps Center for Sustainable Landscapes. And the other is asking a question of how these ideas might translate to a larger context like a neighborhood or a campus. In this case, a neighborhood plan for a community thinking about living cities challenge. So let me get started then. So what is it that causes us to change our thinking? How is it that we find something interesting enough that it makes us think of things and reconceive things in a new way? I think in architecture school, we try to get our students to think about these things all the time and to kind of question where they've come from. And certainly the kind of place that we're at in terms of sustainability, we've seen some of these big shifts. So thinking in pictures. I like to think in pictures. Let's think in some pictures. So what are some of the big things that have caused us to see changes? Is there a way to kind of dim the front lights? It's a little hard to see, I think. What are some of the big things that caused us to kind of change societally? Certainly when we when we got the ability to control our environment, controlling how we create and farm, how we get food from and our resources, controlling our resources is important. But I'm an architect, so I like to think that controlling our environment, and when we got to have settlement patterns and we got to make buildings and we got to hold that climate, those harsh conditions out, well, that was a point that really changed the way we see the world, right? Something like that. Agriculture, architecture, those are things that cause shifts in how we think about things. What's another thing? So, it's not that long ago. I'm only 3 generations out of being in a family that didn't have running water in the house and maybe didn't have sewage. Probably you guys are too. What is it in our environment that has caused shifts in our thinking? We're not that far out from some very different conditions that we take for granted today. And it helps us to kind of think back as to what those conditions are. Because certainly when we got the ability to control our environment, whether through marshaling our resources, whether that be food or energy, or controlling how we can heat or cool, how we keep things in and keep things out that we find desirable, we got to a little bit of an exciting place. We started having a certain amount of power and control. And those things leads us to certain solutions and leads us to certain paradigms of thinking. And sometimes that thinking opens up new ideas. We get an understanding, even looking back at kind of natural processes perhaps, kind of thinking about why California redwood can grow to be the tallest tree in the world, whereas a giant sequoia has a limit, right? One of them can gather water resources from the air and grow taller, while the other one's kind of limited by how much its mechanical system, if you will, can pull the water up high. Well, buildings are kind of like that too. We didn't have tall buildings until we had the physical resources, the structural systems, the mechanical systems, elevators, the way to transport people and resources up high. And so our built environment is kind of reflective of new understandings we have of our control of resources. And we even begin to understand these systems happening in long term, the length of time that is beyond our lifespan. When a giant sequoia dies, it opens up an opening in the forest and you get these large groves of trees that grow around it, right? But our cities aren't so dissimilar too. When large kind of keystone things change, we respond and we marshal resources in a way that tend to reflect that. But we're not always conscious of that. But certainly with the technology that we've had expanding our understanding of change over time, we've been able to see some of those things, especially in the built environment. And arguably, this has led us to some pretty interesting conditions. Some places that we haven't ever been able to occupy before. You know, we live in environments that have been previously uninhabitable. That presents some really interesting opportunities for us. But it also presents a risk that we become disconnected from things that we used to take for granted. Things and understandings of our environment that just came from being situated and within those environments. Now that we have the power to overcome them, what do we choose to do? How do we use our resources appropriately? So another way that we talk about this is, okay, that was thinking in pictures. Let's think in artifacts. Any industrial designers in the audience? No. How many students? One industrial design? Yeah. All right. Cool. How many teachers, faculty, and administrators? Awesome. Thank you. So thinking in artifacts, sometimes if I have industrial designers, they'll recognize some of these things. So let's just take 3 chairs and try to unpack a little bit about the history of those chairs, because we take the things around us for granted, but they're full of stories, right? And we look at these 3 chairs. One's a Windsor chair. One is a chair by Marcel Breuer from about the 30s, 20s, and 30s. And another one is a contemporary chair. Let's take a look at what characterizes these things. In this Windsor chair, everything's made by hand. The resources are locally extracted. You understand how much it takes to turn the wood or to kind of pare the wood down. It's a very kind of tactile experience to create one of these chairs. In the good chairs, there's no nails used. Everything is kind of joined. It's a single material, and it's done by somebody who knows how to work that material. It also happens to be really useful because it's pretty lightweight. And so as we're moving westward from Pittsburgh to Indiana, that's a pretty good thing to carry with you if you had to. Not very heavy, right? The second chair represents a period of time that we were making advances in technology. We had metal. It was a kind of heady time. What could this material do? This chair actually comes out of bicycle tube technology. And as this chair was being, during this period of time, people were thinking, what could I do with this stuff? This is fantastic. Maybe I can make a chair that can be folded up, that can be transportable, that can be distributed to the masses because people needed good quality things, and this is a way to do it. Lastly, this post-industrial chair. This chair is, I don't know if you can tell, it's actually made out of a bunch of found things. It's a bunch of fabric, recycled fabric. It's bound together with the same stuff that you bind packages together to send it. And this represents a different kind of understanding, different connection to our environment. We're mining resources that we hadn't mined before. And it represents different understandings of our resources and the technology we have to use those resources, right? We had finite resources. We couldn't keep extracting things because the limit of a single person making a chair or a small community, limited technology to process that. Then we got a sense of being able to harvest and extract so many more resources, and a sense of unlimited technology, the kind of headiness and optimism that we could just keep working our way out of a problem. I don't know that that's left us in this kind of post-industrial. We're still pretty heady about technology, but we have a sense of finite resources. And when you change that paradigm, when you think differently about your resources, then you start looking to different sources, different waste streams in the past as possible resources. What this really kind of gets to is an idea of feedback loops. In the early work, the feedback loop was immediate. I knew when I made that object, I knew how much work it took to make that chair. I knew how hard it was to take that tree down. I was probably involved in many parts of that process. With the disconnection in the Industrial Revolution of the maker from the resource extraction, we don't know that. We didn't know that as much, right? And now we don't really have a sense even of where our stuff comes from, let alone if we've made it or how much work it takes to make that. So we have this kind of disconnection that causes us to lose some of our understanding of feedback loops. And you can look at architecture as having some of those qualities too. Certain architecture results when you have limited technology and finite resources. And we often call this architecture, refer to vernacular architecture as having some of these qualities, but it can happen in any scenario. And certainly with the Industrial Revolution and the disconnection, the creation of building trades and building professions, architectural profession, landscape architectural profession are products of this period of time when you have specialization. And then lastly, a kind of new sense of needing to look at the bigger picture and ask larger questions because we recognize that that feedback loop is not there anymore, and we need new means of understanding how we relate to our environment because we've made it in a way that we don't have to. So if we don't have to understand it, how might we choose to understand it? We have to be more attentive to our feedback loops and to our environment. So this is a pretty famous quote, paraphrase of it, by Winston Churchill. And he was actually referring to trying to get some political machinations into a space not so dissimilar from this. And he figured, well, really, I want to get my way with this certain piece of legislation, and if some people have to stand, then so be it, because that's probably a good way to kind of manipulate the outcome. We shape our buildings and they shape us. So I'm going to kind of shape this outcome by shaping our buildings, by shaping this particular space. And we have to acknowledge that they do shape us. So let's think with architecture. We've thought with pictures, we've thought with artifacts, let's think with architecture. And ask some questions. Can a building be a tactile demonstration of ecological principles? Can it show us things that we might be blind to and might not see otherwise? And we, for the purposes of our time here on campus, and a good deal of my colleague Dale's research deals with this idea of kind of biologics. And in this example here, this is the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh. It's a system of little plates that flutter in the wind, thinking that maybe we're not attentive to certain things anymore. And by kind of augmenting our understanding of these phenomena, we'll be more attentive or more connected to certain natural phenomena. The second scale to ask is, can a building engage with the surrounding ecosystem or systems? If you think about a building in an urban area, you may not think about ecosystems, but systems. It has a metabolism. Living buildings have metabolism. They have metabolism of resources that flow into the building, and that building is inherently connected to things outside, power grids, climate issues, water issues, human resource issues, human energy flows within it. And what is that metabolism that building has? In this case here, it's a project done for some cottages out in falling water, really looking at engaging natural ecosystems and perhaps scaffolding habitat, really looking at migratory patterns. This is kind of an extreme example of tapping into some of those ecosystem connections. And lastly, can a building change the way we think about each other and our environment? And the example that I'll put up here is probably kind of a mythological example. You might have seen this in person, of a barn raising. When we come together to create a building, it is in itself an act of community building. It connects people and place. And I know that you all are familiar with this because you had a little bit of that going on when a group of students get together to do something amazing and fantastic. And buildings, the creation of those buildings, as any kind of unit, campus unit or otherwise will say, restructures and rewires how people work together. So can we pay attention to that and use it to kind of change the way we think about our environment too, not just each other? So I would argue that those are the hallmarks of what is a living building. And while I'll tell you about living buildings as they're defined in kind of metrics and different systems, this is at the core of what I think a living building is. So why does it matter? A little bit of background. 90% of our time is spent indoors. And I'm sure you can think of times when you've kind of cursed that 10% you have to walk from one campus building to another because it's yucky out and you don't really want to go, or it's hot and miserable and that 10% isn't so friendly. But we spent an extraordinary amount, a kind of evolutionarily unusual amount of time in these environments that we create, so we ought to be very attentive to those. So, you know, we kind of woke up to what the roots of the modern sustainability movement is, say in the 1970s and 1980s, and really it's centered around energy resources, right? Energy efficiency was the thing that we had to pay attention to because we had not enough gasoline. People had a very immediate feedback loop. It gets back to feedback loops. That as soon as that price tag went up, people started thinking, maybe I need to behave differently, maybe I need to design differently. So I think we laughed about this a couple of times in different buildings, but this school, which was designed for a period that didn't have mechanical heating and mechanical cooling, and oh, well, by the way, we didn't go to school in the summer because we knew that it would be too hot. And so that was part of the thing, that this building only had to serve a heating need. It didn't have to serve a cooling need. So the design you see is a diagram. It's a result of a kind of understanding of climate and an immediate feedback loop of being able to control that, right? Well, in 1970s and 80s taught us that maybe this wasn't the right idea, and this building became this building. Believe it or not, that is the same building, but they skinned over all those windows, and they, you can tell only by the 4 columns. And unfortunately, this is where my son's going to go to school next year. So this is a response to a kind of singularity of thinking about environment. And luckily, though, after the 1980s, and there were some issues with sick building syndrome and with the way that you know, this was great because kids never had to look outside and get distracted. But guess what? Being underneath really bad, low-quality fluorescent lights causes a lot of headaches. So people started to say, maybe there's something else that we should be thinking about. And so in the 1990s, energy was still important, but so were some other things. Environmental quality became important. The lighting, the air quality. We needed to address those because those were serious issues. Materials were also beginning to be a concern too. Water was an issue, and I don't know, probably not too much affected here in this region, but certainly in the 1990s, for the first time, the city of Pittsburgh found its rivers, which had been obscured by industry for 100 years. We saw that, and we weren't giving it back, and so these became the issues that were considered to be a kind of environmental sustainability issues in the built environment. And so myself and Mike and many others started thinking about how to put some of these things into a system and talk about it. Folks at the U.S. Green Building Council had been around for a couple years, started thinking about how you talk about this outside of it, and created a series of categories that basically reflect those concerns, and thus was born the LEED building rating system. So you're probably all familiar with this because you have a couple buildings on campus, right? And that's fantastic. LEED is a great tool because there's a couple things about LEED that are kind of funny that we found out about ourselves psychologically, right? We really like to compete against each other, and we like to compete against ourselves. So we like to say, I have the first Unitarian Universalist LEED-rated silver church in Western Pennsylvania that has a 2-story tower that is made out of wood. Okay, good. I got the first. All right, I'm first. That's great, right? we also like to compete against ourselves. And LEAD, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is about public recognition and external validation, but it's also about being able to measure your own performance. So being able to say, you know, when we started this project, we thought we were going to be doing these types of things and get certain points for those things, right? But if we just go a little bit further, we can do a little bit more. And it helps us benchmark against ourselves. And actually, benchmarking is a really, really important thing. And prior to this, even prior to the 1970s, we didn't benchmark anything. We didn't compare. We compared by size. We compared by what material you used and how fancy it was, right? But we didn't compare by, performance or by things that matter to environmental issues. And so that's really the power in LEAD, is that it helps us kind of set a baseline to think about how we compare to ourselves and how we compare to other people. So, in the 2000s, well, these things are still important. We still care about energy efficiency and environmental quality, materials, water, ecosystems, but there are some questions we didn't answer. Again, when we started this, we only asked a few questions about the environment, and now we're asking more questions about the environment. And those questions have to do with beauty and with how we treat each other. And other kind of soft issues, these are still pretty quantifiable, right? I can still measure these things, and we like to kind of stand on those. Those are things we can easily compare each other to. But what about fairness and community? How does that fit into this? Because that's certainly part of the EEE bottom line, right? Environment, equity, economics. What about aesthetics? You know, how do things look? Are they beautiful, right? And so these categories came up and were put into this system, the Living Building Challenge. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Living Building Challenge, this is a framework that the Ross Reserve is looking to use. It is right now kind of the strongest path to a green building that there is, because the threshold for success, for achievement, is very stringent. And so, you know, we work with foundations all the time. Foundations often influence our nonprofit clients. You know, we've got 30 projects we're trying to do, get through the LEAD process with the clients. And oftentimes they're nonprofits. Nonprofits are beholden to foundations. And the foundations in Pittsburgh, at least, are saying, you know what, LEAD's good, but I'm not funding you to get LEAD. You should already be there, right? I'm not giving you any extra money for that. As a matter of fact, don't even come talk to me about bricks and mortar funding unless you are at LEED Gold or LEED Platinum. So the level, the bar has been raised, right? Right now, the bar is set at Living Building Challenge for many of these foundations, because Living Building Challenge represents a strong commitment to these issues. Whereas LEED was based on points, I could say, yeah, I think we're going to get some carbon offset credits. I think we're going to use these extra efficient fixtures. We'll get some extra points that way. LBC says, you know what, there are no choices here in that sense. You don't get to choose whether you're going to do this or that, because they're both really important. You need to kind of, they're all imperatives. You have to do these different things. And some imperatives are more transformational than others. Getting back to this idea of shift, how do things change? How do we change the way we look at environment? The issues that are more important are energy efficiency, materials, and water, still up in that quantified area, right? Because the Living Building Challenge says, you gotta save energy, but you gotta be net zero. That means that you can't use any more energy than you can make. And by the way, how are you going to make that energy? That's a problem, right? At Phipps, it's a botanical garden. We've got organic material. We could harvest methane. We can do some little bit of burning, make some electricity, make some heat. But you can't use combustion. You have to do it non-combustion, which pretty much limits you to renewable generation, wind or solar. So the second thing that you have to pay attention to is this idea of red list. Red list, what's the red list? Materials. They say, well, why do we still tolerate? It's really good that we took formaldehyde out of desktops like this, because, you know, underneath desktops, this is a OSB material. What do they use to put that together? They used to use formaldehyde. So we got a lot of that taken out of the system. But the Living Building Challenge says, why do we tolerate any chemicals in our system that might be harmful? There's a red list of things that you just shouldn't use. And when you start looking at that red list of things, that's a game changer, because it changes the kinds of things you can use and not use. It changes the way architects, contractors, and owners work together, because the process of finding those materials, the process that a manufacturer communicates their materials to you is different. It is shifting the industry radically right now, and we're still in the early stages of understanding what that is. The last area that's really important that I think LBC is changing things is thinking about net zero water. Similar to power, energy, net zero water means that you can't use any more water than you have on your site. If you're living off of your kind of net solar income, you're living off of your net water income, right? Well, that's okay. Seemingly, you can't flush it off your property either. We kind of do that already with regulations, but that can be tough. I'm not sure if anybody else is kind of in your mind racking up things that, wow, that's really hard. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you do that. I'm thinking about my house here, and I live in a townhouse, and I don't have a yard. How would I harvest enough water? Where would I put the water I don't use? You're starting to get at the shift that happens with LBC. And that's called scale jumping. It says that some things I can do on site, some things my building can do, right? But some things I need to extend out to other properties, to other facilities. I need to draw from a larger community. And that is reshaping the way we work together. That is reshaping the way projects come together, the way owners structure contracts and agreements. And I think on campuses in particular is a really interesting thing, because it's all one entity, and yet there are resource flows from different buildings and different units that, when captured, would be one step closer to being kind of efficient as a district and not just as a series of individual buildings. So this shifts us towards this idea of systems thinking, and systems thinking is tough, and it's hairy, and it's long, and you have to kind of come to relationships and agreements that you don't have to when you're just doing a single building or you're just doing a single system. It also requires us to see things in a different way. We need to see forces and flows. We need to see the dynamics of the system and not just simply the snapshot in time of the system to know how these things are going to kind of work over time. And then lastly is kind of the way that we talk about these things. And, you know, sustainable design's been a buzzword that's been around for a long time. And I'd just like to question how we talk about sustainable design for a minute. You know, sustainable design, perhaps we call it regenerative design, because sustaining only describes a certain relationship. Both sustainable and regenerative describe mutually beneficial relationships. But sustainable just says we keep the status quo, right? But if you regenerate, maybe you can make it better than it was before. Mutually beneficial, both get that. So let's question what that means. That is a constant renegotiation. It's a constant thinking. It's examining flows and dynamics of the system. And design, well, I come from a kind of love and passion for design. So I think we are all designers, because we all mediate between us and our environment, whether it's the way you kind of arrange things in your office to suit your needs, or whether you're designing a building or designing an object. We all have this engagement with our environment, and that's design, right? So design and sustainable design, that's not a noun, it's an action. And so these things, the students in the kind of room here, this is the place where your opportunities are going to come in when you get into the field. Is that the jobs that deal with sustainable design haven't been invented yet, because they're about the kind of constant change of these flows and mediation between our environment. Whether you're an engineer, whether you're a biologist, it's still about this renegotiation with our environment and understanding what that relationship is, and that's going to be the sweet spot for where your careers will probably be. So in that sense, design, how we make places, the act of that renegotiation, how we work together, it transforms us as well as it transforms the places that we make. And we have to be kind of cognizant of those things. We have to understand how those things happen. So I'm going to talk about two different projects, and I'm going to try to describe these not so much as a list of technologies, because I don't think that that's, because oftentimes technology isn't the most important piece of it. As a matter of fact, some of you in the room might be working on projects where you could like take us to school literally about some great technology you're working on, or something that you, product you're developing, things like that. That's all good stuff. But I want to talk about how these things kind of fit together as a system and how it works as a relationship, as a community. The two projects, one is going to be the Phipps Conservatory Center for Sustainable Landscapes, which will be LEED Platinum. It's going for CITES certification, which is a kind of landscape-based certification system, and will also be a Living Building Challenge project as well. As Mike said, it's about to open up maybe the next week. So we're all really excited to kind of see this thing come to fruition. The second project that I'm going to talk about, the Larimer Living City, takes these principles of living buildings and extends it out to a community. Because as I suggested with the idea of scale jumping, sometimes an individual building isn't the right scale to start thinking about these systems. The systems are bigger and broader. So let's start with Phipps. So, Phipps Conservatory. I thought it was kind of interesting comparing this and the Ross Reserve, just the little bit that I've gotten to know about the Ross Reserve. Phipps Conservatory is a 100-year-old conservatory. You get a sense it's a glass house kind of model. This is a model that brought foreign ecosystems into an urban environment and created a place where they could survive, right? So you've got the desert room, and you've got the jungle room, and you've got the butterfly room. And so it's like a little place, it's a little collection place for ecosystems. But it was never thought about that way, right? But because it was created in terms of ecosystems, they didn't think about systems per se, right? In terms of the building, they also kind of had only limited things to work with in terms of their larger understanding. It's pretty simple stuff. It's metal mullions, single pane glass. It's low brick walls that have louvers in them. When it gets too hot in the summer, you paint the glass white so it's not as much sun comes in. When you need more sun in the winter, you wash that whitewash off and you get more exposure. When it's too hot, you open the louvers on the bottom, you open the louvers on the top, you get some air movement through. And when it's too cold, well, you fire up the coal-fired steam plant in the valley and you start pumping water through the pipes, right? So it was pretty passive, but it has some inputs that are kind of interesting. So Phipps got a new life. It got a new executive director. It ceased to be a public entity, which not a lot of people were thinking innovatively about it when it belonged to the city of Pittsburgh, but it became its own nonprofit. And the director, Richard Piacentini, started to think about these things in kind of systems ways. And the first thing they knew, they needed to make some physical space improvements because it just was kind of yucky no matter what. Don't even mention the word environment. It was just not a great place to get into the building. They needed a new welcome center. So what you're looking at is the new welcome center, and it's predominantly underground. And when Richard began this project, that was the primary purpose of it, was to get people into the building. But as he began to go into the project and begin to ask questions, he started to think about, well, you know, we're paying a lot of money here. We have a feedback loop of resource use for the existing greenhouse. I don't want to add more square footage on and pay that much more money, right? I want this thing to be efficient. And then recognizing the alignment of efficiency and this new LEED building rating system with who their audience was, he really pushed his design team to think about this, and they got LEED certification for this part of the project. But the next project was in the backside of it. And this project was for a tropical greenhouse. Now, both have very specific needs, right? Heating and cooling and occupancy needs. But the tropical greenhouse has a kind of biological system that it has to support and with some more needs, if you will. And so they designed the building to have the maximum solar exposure because they knew tropics need a lot of solar exposure. Richard started asking questions during the process. Again, it wasn't designed as 100% to be a LEED rated building or to be zero energy, any of that, but he just bits and pieces started saying, well, why shouldn't we do it this way? For instance, he had somebody come in from Germany who talked about these crazy pipes that you could put underground. They run a couple 100 feet, and you draw air in through the pipes, and it comes up, and the ground's 55 degrees. So if it's 30 degrees outside or 20 degrees outside, by the time it gets into the building, it's much warmer than the ambient outside air is, right? And while the plants may not like 55 degrees, they can't survive 30 or 20 degrees. So here's a way to deliver fresh air, either in cold weather or in warm weather. That 80-degree air runs through these tubes, earth tubes they're called, and comes up and is already cooled, which helps to temper the space for us, because the plants love it, but we might not like it so much, right? So he heard about this system, and he said, whoa, stop, let's put them in, let's give it a try. Talked about how ventilation was going to happen, opening up the roof 100%, so essentially it's an outside space. He looked at different shading systems to find where the logic was. He kind of took it system by system by system and challenged his design team to design something so much so that when they built it and they got some results back, they realized that this part of the conservatory was the most efficient greenhouse in the world. And so that started tasting good. That was a challenge worth standing up for, and he began to ask, so in everything we do, how can we do it better? How can we do this better? And that's the kind of way that things happened in those first two projects. He got to a point when they achieved certain things that they had to ask, how could we not do this better? You know, we have gotten to a stage where we've raised the bar so continuously, we kind of have to think about this because it's our responsibility, and it's also kind of a market driver too. Let's be honest, it's good business as well. And so the last phase of the project is this kind of back piece that you see in there. Tropical forest, greenhouses, and welcome center were done. What there is on this escarpment, there's about a 25-foot slope, and those buildings that you see in the lower right-hand side are actually the Department of Public Works. That's where they stored trucks and rock salt, and there was a gas pump there. Not a really nice place. Not certainly a place that you think of as being environmentally friendly at all. But what Richard and his team at the FIPS board saw was the potential of this thing being a regenerative site instead. And so phase 3 of their construction project is the Center for Sustainable Landscapes. Now, in this case here, the Center for Sustainable Landscapes was not something that they could do bits and pieces. You couldn't just do an earth tube at a time. You had to think it through really systemically. If you want to do a regenerative building, if you want to do an LBC, Living Building Challenge building, you have to look at all of those systems together and early. And you have to have a lot of different people from different perspectives early. And sometimes that means you got to have the maintenance guy in. Sometimes it means you got to have the Department of Environmental Protection official who's going to permit your gray water system. And sometimes it means that you have the people who are going to use the space in the room all at the same time. Because within that room is a lot of collective knowledge. And we call that a charrette. That's a kind of working workshop like that. That's what we're going to be doing tomorrow for the Ross Reserve project. But it's part of a larger process called the integrative design process, or IDP, or you'll hear it termed other things, integrated design process, integrated delivery process. What it is it's a model for using multiple different disciplines and getting everybody in the room, and the joke is it requires everybody talking about everything early. Because the idea is if you get all this out early, you can understand what's at stake, and then later down the line, when things come up, people are aligned. You don't have somebody saying, oh, sorry, I cleaned this with bleach because I didn't know we weren't supposed to, or more likely putting rock salt on a place that in a porous paving system or something where the system itself is problematic, but also in the delivery of the project. Whenever you have to do all your engineering and it comes to kind of value engineering certain systems, you've all gotten together at the beginning to say, look, these are the things that are most important. If we take this piece out of it, we're going to lose performance here and here. And we all agreed that that kind of long-term thinking is where this project needs to be. So it's a kind of value alignment and a knowledge management issue, and it feels crazy to have all those people in the room at the same time the first time you do it. I guarantee it. But it's a very, very helpful process, and FIPS could not have been done without it. So it was out of those sessions that design concepts are generated, and an amazing thing happens because the mechanical engineer is thinking about parking and landscape design, and the landscape designers are thinking about where the ducts are going to go and where airflow is coming out and things like that. And everybody has to think from their expertise but in somebody else's shoes. And that's a really, really important thing to happen. So the kind of resulting thing, if you remember those buildings in the photograph, those are down here. They're reused. That was a commitment that came out in this early charrette integrated design process. Unequivocally, FIPS was committed to saving those buildings. So that put everybody on the same page at that time. What it resulted in was an office and classroom and kind of extending the visitor experience out of the conservatory with both this building and the landscape part of it. And so the building itself is that's coming online has a lot of interesting features. But the features couldn't have happened. The systems, it's not a very big building. It's, I think, 21,000 square feet. But the systems they're not so high tech that they aren't things that, for instance, technology that you don't already have here on campus somewhere, right? But it's in the way that they work together that's where the special sauce of the LBC is, because if one thing isn't working, then other systems are not able to capture their return based on those things working together. So things like for instance, well, actually, let me walk you through some of these things. This is the floor plan, just a little bit of the classroom space, and then office space, and then a green roof demonstration space on the upper floor. It has things that are important for understanding what the possibilities of this space is. For instance, this tall tower, this the upper part of that massing there is a stair tower, and one of the things that the client and the team said is, you know, what if that thing doesn't have to be fully heated and cooled? Nobody's desk is in there. We just walk through that space, and we might even have some plants and living systems in there that would not want it to be that warm or that kind of constantly monitored. So what if we just take that thing offline? You know, we don't have to condition it to the same level as everything else. Let's talk about some of the other kinds of systems and occupancy matches that we can make. But one thing that the team came to, and in this other project that we're working on is just the beginning stages of Living Building Challenge, it seems reified that this is an important step to take for Living Building Challenges. You have to work the passive strategies before you work the active. A lot of times we get excited about a technology or about a certain thing, and we want to do it in the project, but ultimately, if the concept of negawatt we were talking about at lunch, it's the energy you never have to buy. If you can just create a building that is as sipping lightly as possible, then you don't have to buy that extra solar panel, and there's your return. Well, I think it's probably true for here, but in Pittsburgh, the most efficient building is a box with no windows. That's probably the thinking behind that school building that I showed you. We know that that's not an option. Not an option. So there's a balance between understanding performance, human occupancy needs, health concerns, aesthetics, and therein lies the essence of the design process, is figuring those things out. So you look at building orientation and massing. how that thing sits on the site, how the exterior, the building, the thermal envelope is formed, getting as much insulation as you can without compromising the need to connect to the outside, understanding which spaces need to be heated and which spaces don't, taking advantage of natural daylight. Let's not have the lights on at all if we can, right? Natural ventilation. Let's not turn on the mechanical systems at all if we don't need to. And so I think I have this diagram up. It's a diagram by Stuart Brand. I mean, it's just really interesting to think about the kinds of decisions that you need to make in a building project. This diagram, the thicker the line, it represents the system that is the least likely to change. It's got the longest cycles of change, right? This site. Once you site a building, you're not going to pick that building up and ever move it again, right? You're not going to significantly change the massing or the form of it. So those are really important things. The next thing is the structure. You know, you might go in and change a beam, but you don't go in and restructure a building. You don't change it from a masonry bearing to a steel bearing building, right? So those things are really critical to think through. Then your skin, your envelope, that changes more frequently, right? The first generation of all glass curtain wall skyscrapers in New York City all got their skin changed because it has a lifespan to it, 50, 60 years. Services, that's your mechanical systems, your electrical. Those things change a little more frequently. We adjust them both in their specification, their equipment, and in their configuration, right? Then space plan. This is the thing we think about when we think about changing. We change this all the time. We put in a wall here, we take out a wall there, we move furniture around. That's the stuff part. That's a thing that changes all the time. And so when we're making decisions on getting to net zero or living building challenge, certain things have to be done well from the beginning because we're not likely to change it. You know, truthfully, stuff, a solar panel can be stuff, right? We're really into that thing now, but 10 years from now, there's going to be a technology that's going to, you know, outperform it by 20 times. That's a thing that's going to change frequently. So designing to allow for those shearing levels of change is a really important thing to do. But 20 years from now, we're not going to change where that building's located and how it is. So out of this process resulted some ideas of preferable orientation and massing, kind of relationship to the site and the park that surrounds it, and how to get parking out of the way as much as possible, things that are less likely to change. Thinking about building envelope, saying if we're creating this condition to the south, we better deflect light into the space, shaping our ceilings, things like that. I think that, what was the hospitality, the Marriott building has some of these things also at work there. But you know, one of the interesting things, one of the things that I don't think living building could happen, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, is that we have a much better opportunity to do modeling and to understand how systems perform, because you're always in a predictive role. You have to figure out how lighting's going to influence your HVAC, how there, you know, how much electricity you're going to have to buy, because if you're doing living building challenge, you have a direct feedback loop of having to understand how much solar panels you're buying for that. So you need to be able to model these things and be confident in that, and our tools today allow us to do that much better than we ever have before. Same thing with natural ventilation, understanding those flows in an intuitive sense, but also a kind of measured sense. In this case, computational fluid dynamics, a kind of section cut to model where that air is going to go, where the temperature gradient is going to be, how that works. Same thing. Where that affects the kind of fundamental design move, that atrium, being able to ventilate and pull air from different parts of the building was one of those big massing moves that had to happen early. And so that you can get to these types of goals, performative goals, but this isn't the stuff that people see. We can put the dashboards out. The dashboards are great for people to understand how much energy is being used. But we perceive that energy, we perceive the quality of that space far more intuitively than we do in the kind of numbers and quantification side of it. So we need to do this, but we need to understand that this isn't the stuff that is going to speak to the average building user. so that we can get to very specific goals that we need to know what net zero is. So once you get past the passive systems, you get to active systems, trying to close loops and integrate those active systems, understanding where some things kind of can benefit others. And working with us on this project for Ross Reserve is an engineer, Alan Traugott from CJL Engineers, who also worked on this project with us. For instance, in this project here, he recognized that the air that's being exhausted out of the building is being exhausted at a fairly constant flow, and it always creates a little zone of kind of, it's a breeze, right? If you stood outside of that, you would feel that constantly. And he is working with a manufacturer to see about capturing some of that with a small turbine to offset some of that. That's energy. It's an energy flow that he was able to identify and think about in a different way. And so this looks like a complicated diagram, but really it just talks about closing all the loops with different pieces and parts. Now, if we can eliminate some of these technologies, that probably simplifies it. If we can decrease the load, we probably don't need as big technologies or as many technologies. That's that idea of being using passive systems as much as possible, and then active systems. And these have implications over space. And so one of the things that happened in this project, it would be true for any project here on campus, and to some extent we're going to try to think about this for the Ross Reserve, is thinking about a campus or adjacent things as a battery. Because if we have too much water in this project, we can use it to water plants in the greenhouse. If we have too much energy, we can feed it back into the main campus of FIPS because they can use that energy all the time. We have those kinds of varying loads in systems where we work together, different academic buildings. We're going to look at this structure at the Ross Reserve and the existing facility that's there and see if we have that opportunity to use that kind of battery storage capacity within our own system. You know, kind of metering and getting extra solar energy, sending it back into the grid is a similar idea, but how can you capture that within your own kind of campus, like FIPS campus? So this actually doesn't look like this anymore. It's almost done and going to be opening soon. There are some great videos online if you're interested in learning more about it. And so I encourage you actually come and visit. That would be even better. But one of the things that FIPS that really brought up though is the relationship to a larger context. And in this case, FIPS sits on the edge of a park. It sits within the city of Pittsburgh. It shares a heating plant with Carnegie Mellon and the museums, and it has a kind of, it's interconnected. And LBC is not an off-the-grid, I'm not going to look at anything kind of approach. It's an integrative part of the systems approach. It can be off the grid, it can be completely separate, but chances are it's going to acknowledge that you're part of a larger system. So the second project that I'm going to go through is not building focused, it's kind of neighborhood focused, and it's for a neighborhood in the city of Pittsburgh. This is we'll call it the Living Cities concept, and it's like most communities, it's a community that has a lot of stories already written on its paper. And it's a place where we look to see where things were making kind of a systemic sense and where they weren't. And of course, the fact that there's neighbors there and people living there is a pretty important piece of it. How do you engage these guys? How do you, in a building, you just have the building stakeholders, right? In a community, you have people who don't even recognize that their built environment matters, right? So how do you engage these folks? It's two communities. This work comes from work in two communities in Pittsburgh, Larimer and Homewood. You'll see images of Larimer, so take a look. Larimer kind of looks like a leaf, purely coincidental, but that will help you identify the kind of context. It's a neighborhood that has some large-scale kind of former industrial or office buildings, kind of retail, some larger retail. And then you see it has a lot of just small-scale residential housing. And the shape of this neighborhood is because there are valleys that go down and eventually feed to the Ohio River. So that's kind of the form-making aspect of why this community is shaped the way it is. So Larimer, if you see the kind of denuding of this, began here with each of these little squares representing density. The purple is commercial, the orange is residential. In 1940, there were 13,000 people there, and it looked like this. And throughout the decades, it's gotten less and less, so that today there are less than 2,000 people there. And this school looks something like this right now. So this is a tough but not uncommon situation, especially in former Rust Belt cities. How do you deal with that kind of change in the community and disinvestment? Right now, the community is seeing some reason to believe that change is happening and some growth that is beginning to occur there. Part of it is due to internal efforts that they're making. Part of it is just due to a general economic outlook for the region as being somewhat positive. So what we did is look at stages to how this growth might occur, how they can control it, and how it can use these principles of the living building into a living city. And so in 2035, this is the kind of looking at the end, kind of a diagram of the end design. In 2035, you've got, just look at the colors of this. It's far more diverse. The ecosystem, if you will, of what is in this community is far different than it was in 1940. And what you're seeing there is attention to a couple things that never got designed in 1940. It is site, thinking about hillsides and open space as working spaces, whether that be for water or for food production, thinking about distributed energy and infrastructure. Where do you take care of your sewage? Where do you take care of your water? Where do you produce energy? How those things might take place at a smaller scale because there's more efficiencies there and build more resiliency for that community. So in a typical urban design process, you look at all the pieces and parts, you see who lives there, you see where the vacancies are, you see where the economic issues are, and you kind of design in a way that takes into account things like open space and recreation, different uses, transit, things like that, and those are all still very important things in this type of planning. But the thing that's different is that as per the Living Building Challenge, you have to think about things on a kind of broader systemic scale, and you'll see two things that are recognizable, energy and water, because those two things are still very important at the district scale, right? Food didn't come up at all when we talked about buildings. What we talked about was materials, right? In a neighborhood scale, materials is important, but those are decisions made down the line. But food is a major infrastructure piece and needs to happen. Those decisions need to happen at the large-scale planning level. So what we've observed is that technological innovation is often how we start talking about sustainability, but really kind of community formation is the difference between making these things work or not work. And similar to the way that I talked about the integrative process and needing to come together on things, there's a kind of corollary to that in urban design. When people think about eco-districts, if you've ever heard the term or ever thought about it as a district, like sustainability issues as a district, you'll hear things like vacant lots and planting gardens and doing some geothermal, some solar panels. And you kind of throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks in an urban plan. And there's a vacant lot, it's going to be an urban garden. That's great. Those are good things to have happen. But there's a logic to how these things can be done. And that has to do with community capacity. These things are organized by time frame, how long it takes you to do it, how much time you need to have somebody to advocate for that thing or to maintain that thing, and then the capacity of the community to do it. Do they have decision-making mechanisms in place? Do they have organizational learning? Can they communicate about it? Do they have legal structures in place? Do they have financial resources? That's why communities that are well off or thinking about maybe developed by a sole developer can do things in this upper right-hand corner. They can do big scale things like district heating and district cooling, whereas typically lower income communities are down here at changing light bulbs and planting gardens because they don't have either the long-term planning capacity or mechanism in place, or they lack some of the other kind of community resources that are needed. So Larimer and Homewood are predominantly African American lower income communities. The idea of equity was primary. The client we were working with is a community group, and that was one of the major issues for the project. And the idea that design can transform people as well as places, the act of making a place is an act of making a community. And those two things happen simultaneously. And so thinking of things not just as solutions but as systems, testing quantitatively. You know, in an urban design project, you'll test economic models quantitatively, but rarely will you test how much energy it takes to take that community to net zero. And if you did take it to net zero, what would it look like? Wow, that's a lot of area. Those squares represent the area of solar panels overlaid on the plan of the community. Could we even do that? That's probably leads us to believe, as it did when we looked at this, that we're really looking at interim technologies. We're looking at cogen. We're looking at other fuel cell technologies, other things that have to happen to make this thing work. How do you structure the community agreements? How do you understand who's the best entity to take a look at that and to kind of put that part of the neighborhood plan as their first priority together to see this happen? Because it's not going to happen with every homeowner putting solar panels on their roof. Likewise, when you look at a kind of detailed part of any of these projects, there are certain projects that, because they carry infrastructure investment opportunities, should become the spark projects. Whether it's because it's public investment, like fixing up a school or putting a new field in, that could also, by the way, hold stormwater and maybe be part of a geothermal system that's put in, or whether it be a new development project that then finds its way out into incentivizing community participation in solar panels, or in actually extending the geothermal infrastructure out physically so that other existing houses and units can tap into it. This represents new business opportunities. It represents new kind of regulatory things that need to be in place. And for communities like Larimer, who have a plan and a vision, is where they want to be going. So you look at this in terms of water, understanding if this is the volume of water that comes off of that neighborhood with 2,000 people on the left, all of that dark blue band in the middle is just pure runoff. Last August, we had a big rainstorm in the city of Pittsburgh. So much water came off of this neighborhood and other neighborhoods in that sewer shed that down in the valley, the water rose so fast that the 4-lane roadway down there flooded so fast that one woman got sucked down the sewer grate, and a whole minivan of mother and 2 kids were submerged so fast that when they sent the rescue boat out, they didn't even know her car was there. That is not something that happens or should happen in a 21st century city. And it's something that we can solve by thinking about infrastructure and living cities at this scale. How do we think about our resource flows as a community and set goals and take advantage of regulatory issues in a way that changes the infrastructure and performance? So in this case here, with 2,000 people, we have that dark blue band of water, that volume of water coming off, and with more efficient fixtures and with doing a lot of kind of greening and cascading water storage systems, you can infiltrate majority of that water, that runoff water, back into the ground. Instead of paying for a pipe and a $500,000 gate to close the road when it floods, let's at least get the community some benefit in creating parks and open spaces that are performative and also pleasant places to be. And again, thinking about what the assets are in that community, how people can pay for things or not pay for things. Businesses have different capacity to deal with things. The water they get is different quality than what comes off of the residential district. How do all those things go together to create districts? And when our consent decree to take care of our combined sewer overflow throws money into our system for dealing with stormwater issues, let's not pay for pipes. Let's pay for systems that support a larger vision for the community and not just an end-of-pipe solution. And like with the energy, this also says that certain projects in a smaller area have capacity to spark or to catalyze other projects. Anytime you do a major infrastructure improvement, how does it spread throughout the community? And specifically in this community, how do residents gain more equity in their property, or perhaps buy in or get equity in the community that they were never able to have before? Lastly is food, and this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. We were up on the reserve thinking about food because you're kind of surrounded by fields, and presumably some of those are being used for food, probably also for eventually making fuel too. But how do food and waste be part of the same cycle? How do we create systems and understand open spaces and things that had not really been thought of as design opportunities as part of this system? One of the things we were talking about is this concept of a food forest, where there's a movement, a light in Pittsburgh, that food forests really focus on fruit and nut trees, and it's high protein food, but calorie per calorie is more efficient in production than some of the kind of farming methods so that you might use in an urban scenario. So how do we kind of use every asset we have within this system, in this case the nutrients and waste system, in order to think scalar? Every building in this neighborhood is not going to do Living Building Challenge, nor should it. But like this, even a building that doesn't do Living Building Challenge but is in this kind of concept of an eco-district would have a chance at gaining benefit from those concepts. So, lastly, just want to kind of take us back to the Ross Reserve. It's a modest program in comparison to a neighborhood or even a kind of big facility in greenhouses that Phipps is. But it has a lot of interesting opportunities. The questions still remain the same. How do we think differently about the making of this place? If anything, the Ross Reserve has this incredible capacity to connect people to this amazing resource. We walked through it this morning, and it's fantastic, and there's so many stories and amazing places to experience. How do we use this facility to help people connect to that? Asking those same questions, can our places be tactile demonstrations of ecological principles? And hopefully you've seen some of that in the projects that are going through the Living Building Challenge process that I presented. Secondly, can our places engage within the surrounding ecosystem, whether that be a kind of living material, food-based, or whether it be a kind of energy flows and resources like air and water? And lastly, can the way we make places change the way we think about each other and our environment, connecting people in place? Not just connecting us because we both work together, we all work together to make this place, but connecting the students who are going to come 10 years from now to a place because somebody now thought about it, understood its specialness, and created a scenario by which somebody could come in the future and kind of tactily and haptically experience that place and change the way maybe they think about this whole region. We have to be more attentive to our feedback loops. We have to create living buildings, and not just the way that the LBC defines it, but thinking about it more holistically. We need to see forces and flows and think in systems thinking. That's where all the great research here on campus and all the folks who are engaged in kind of technical issues, they have an amazing capacity to see how these things work. I can tell you that Carrie understands the systems and forces and flows of the kind of ecology on that site, and why certain plants move in certain places and the animals follow or don't follow. That is an amazing resource, but people can look at buildings, people can look at larger infrastructure issues and see those things too, and they need to be brought to this question. And you need to be able to synthesize that, because design is both an action and it's a final result, and it can transform people as well as places. So that ultimately maybe we could all be at the same place where Richard Piacentini was not just asking how do we do this better, but how could we not do this better? it's the way that we should be doing it. Why would we ever tell our students to write a paper, oh, just stop there at 8 pages. You don't need to overachieve. It's okay. You know, there are definitely challenges and impediments and cost and technology and all those things that get thrown out there. But in the kind of big scope of things, that's the students we're sending out into the world, is to ask those questions. How could we not do this better? And what better place to ask that question but here in the environment that they are learning in right now? So on that, I'll take questions. Mm-hmm. I think I know what you're talking about. You're talking about different ways of dealing with curbing and things in for stormwater, right? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I have to ask you, when you ask a question, if you don't mind pressing the button and doing this too.
Awesome. I actually wanted to use this anyway. What we were trying to do was we were trying to see if we could change West Lafayette's building codes or infrastructure codes to accommodate for that. And what we found was that it's more of like an Indiana infrastructure code that you use retention ponds and things like that instead. And I guess from my perspective, I think more along the lines of this, where why would you want to have pipes and infrastructure and create this artificial reservoir when you can just put it straight back into the groundwater? And I guess my question is that something that's looked at through LBC? Is that something that's more promoted by LBC? Or does it really matter, I guess?
No, so LBC, right now, the current system really, although it says that it could do multiple scales, it's really set up well for doing buildings right now, right? So the question you're asking is public infrastructure and right-of-way, and it's not really set up to do that. But it's a great question, because if you have a property that you could never achieve that because of site limitations, then there is a role for public infrastructure indeed, so why not do that better? There are a lot of great things happening, and you see things happening where there's pressure due to CSO, combined sewer overflow limitations, consent decrees, things like that. I'm a big fan of beta testing, because you can do a project and you can call it beta, and it gives you like a higher, you have more room to take a risk because it's a beta, right? We're testing it. We have an idea and we're testing it, and we acknowledge that it could work or it could not work, right? And I think that a great place to start, if what you're dealing with, is to see if you can get them to accept a beta version of something somewhere, just enough to test it, and then see, once you get that in the ground and you get that system going, it will work. And then they'll follow with the regulations or the economic infrastructure to really make that happen on a much larger scale. Other questions? Yeah.
So with the conservatory project, what was the biggest challenge that you ended up facing? Was there any problem that you encountered that you couldn't overcome?
The two biggest challenges were energy and the red list. And the red list is partially a big challenge right now because manufacturers do not want to give you information that's being requested. So when you call up a manufacturer and ask them for, I need to know what's in your product, either they're going to call proprietary issues, or they're going to be afraid that because they have it in their product and it's on the red list, that it's going to be branded as evil, right? And the truth is that there are some of those things that are there because they do what they do well. But this system pushes it to see, are there alternatives? It just keeps pushing the system to say, is there a better way of doing it? Is there a better way of doing it? So right now, I think once the first flush of LBC projects go through, manufacturers, you call a product rep, but you get a response from the lawyer. So like once that happens and people understand, okay, we ought to put this out there. Same thing happened with LEED. You called up a product rep, they had no idea what you were asking, they sent you to this engineer or that engineer, and until they recognized that it was a market driver, that they were either early or they were going to be missing the boat, once they got their stuff in place, now you call them up, they send you the sheet, here's our LEED specs, that's easy. That's going to happen with the red list too. So, and the other one was energy, and energy is just tough because there's no combustion, so that leaves you very little choice. It puts you at solar, and if that, I mean, for us it did, because that was the only thing we had, and so that has a cost, and maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's a good thing because it's a short feedback loop to know, okay, if we do this, if we have this much more energy draw, we need this many more panels. It's a very kind of, we were talking about it as like, if you heat your house with wood, you're not going to leave the front door open because every time you do and that house gets flushed out, you're hauling another load of wood in. So you feel that, right? You feel that pain. And I think that's the feedback loop phenomena with solar panels and those types of resources. So, another question? Yeah. In the back. I'll wait.
How difficult
Oh, wait, can you,
This mic is dead.
oh,
I
okay.
think. Or does it work now? No, it's
All right,
dead.
great.
Does it work? How difficult was it on the Larimore project to convince the people that they needed to be doing this?
Okay, so the Larimer, although if you're native, you say Larmer, the Larmer project, is a plan, and so it's part of a master plan for the community. It has many different moving parts. So, for instance, to answer that question, there's a business district there, and we have brought in a consultant to look at, to consult with the community to see if there's a way of structuring an economic return for a couple businesses with their kind of bigger, older warehouses, maybe like 20, 30,000 square foot warehouses, to do some district heating and cooling. So that is an economic model that will be based on their particular assets, their building type, their site constraints, and making the economic model, in this case, making the funding available. So when you say how easy is it to convince the community, that's just one part of it. When you talk about the homeowners, that's a whole different way of looking at sustainability, and the community's done an incredible job of a bunch of different things. I'll just tell you a few. They've done programs going house to house, getting people to save energy, because that's the first part, right? We don't want to just go kind of put solar panels on everybody's house. We need to get these houses up to speed, and they're not in very good shape, frankly. So they've got 50 different homeowners on board, did a little competition. Out of that, probably netted 5 to 10 homeowners who are not just committed to that change of practices, but have committed to going out into the community and getting other people to do it. So that's part of that beginning seed for that part. But there will probably be issues with stormwater coming up soon, so convincing homeowners to act on changing, whether it's disconnecting their downspouts or doing some sort of street-based, we have this concept called water streets, which I think is similar to what you were talking about. That's going to be a different, nobody signs on the bottom line and says, I commit to all these things. It's really a strategy by strategy thing that has to happen as incentives are in place. But if the community is committed to those ideas, and if there is some kind of quantitative way of measuring, hey guys, we did it. We got 10 streets onto water street systems, and we have saved this many gallons of water, then there's a very real kind of return for, or at least conception of it, right? So like in some cities, I think Philadelphia does this, you pay for percentage of water that's, or percentage of your property that's impervious, because assuming that that water is just going to run off, so your roofs and your parking lots. That is the kind of thing that could shift the community to take that piece of the plan and mobilize it, and the community is saying, okay, great, we're going to pay attention to that. It's coming up in City Council. We're going to advocate for it, and we're going to be ready to help our residents when it comes through. So it's those kinds of pieces. What the plan enables them to do is to think about these things and plan ahead, to advocate for infrastructure or regulatory things that would support it, and then be ready to do it. But it's a long, long process, and it doesn't happen all at once for sure. So, another question.
So you mentioned this is possible to do on university campus. Are there any universities that are actually looking at doing the Living Building Challenge?
You know, we just looked at, was there any Living Building Challenge in Indiana, which we didn't see any. I don't know. Mike, do you know? The wow, that's like a voice. Yeah.
Washington University in Missouri has, I think, the second living building. And it's about 10,000 square foot visitor center or eco center, but there's a classroom component. And
Yeah, I think, I don't know that, like for instance, I know on our own campus we've got requirements for LEED. I don't think it will ever be, right now the living buildings are small. They tend to be small because there's kind of, to get to scale of a large building for living building challenges, it would be a really tough thing right now until the systems are in place to respond, the market's in place to respond. But I would think that once you start getting past a certain scale building, you're starting to think more like a district. You're starting to think bigger scale, and so that's going to present different challenges. And I think universities are actually really, of all the ways to do a district, you're not haranguing 200 different residents and 100 different business owners to do something. You know, you are kind of centralized, and that's the benefit. So there's a lot of things that are happening. I think, you know, improvements in your energy delivery systems, things like that, that are supportive of a kind of eco-district concept, but maybe aren't being called that right now because there's no maybe quantification goals or, I mean, that's not particular to you. I think that's true across universities, so. Other questions? Yeah.
So the concept of you know, zero water and zero energy and that sort of thing, it seems to me that the sort of footprint of the project would have to be relatively large in order for you to take, you know, use space in lots of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge with the Ross is that, I mean, there's a sense in which we want the footprint to be very small because it's a biological station.
Mm-hmm.
So how is all that going to work out?
When you say footprint, you mean physical footprint,
Yeah.
not like ecological
Yeah,
footprint.
yeah.
There's a scale at which these things need to happen, and so you got a sense of that in that neighborhood diagram when we said this is how much area solar panels are going to take. And guess what? You don't have enough roofs in this neighborhood to do that. Because right now that is being held as the only technology that can do that or wind, right? There are space limitations. You size down the draw on this thing. You decrease the demand as much as possible, and that is what happens. But in terms of the other impact, you don't. You need to also, the other thing we're just getting into, and I don't have a handle on, is like water draw. For instance, if this were a roadside rest stop, right, we'd have a huge demand for water that we could probably never fulfill on site. And so we'd be looking at scale jumping, where we'd be looking at who has access and who doesn't, and kind of going in and out. I think the scale jumping we're going to be doing at Ross is probably much more limited, but so is the demand. It's a much more manageable demand. It's like it's a little interesting kind of experiment because it's a scale that's really knowable, as opposed to when you get to like some of these larger structures, knowing what they can draw from. Yeah.
One issue with something like this that might apply at the Ross, and also when I think about trying to do things like this at home, is if you're under a tree canopy, then solar becomes much trickier and wind becomes much trickier, and you know, it's great for some of the cooling that you might want in the summer, but and you know, if it's deciduous, it's fine for the winter too, but there are a lot of challenges when it comes to electricity. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like on my own house, I don't have the solar access, and gosh darn it if I'm going to, you know, tear out the 100-year-old trees to get to it. So, you know, in the neighborhood scale, we use a thing called interim technologies that say that, you know, if an end goal is a product, and truthfully, we could question how environmentally sustainable the manufacturing of solar panels is too, if we really want to go out there, right? Planning a system to say that what other resources are on that Ross site? There probably are other resources, and that's what we're going to try to understand tomorrow, what those other resources are. Water. I know that there's running water on site. I think it's kind of on a bluff kind of wind condition maybe, right? So looking at some of those things. But saying, you know, right now, the interim condition might be solar panels, or it might have some combustion. But as soon as that tree that we know is blocking our access, solar access, comes down, which it will eventually, then we're ready. We've set up the systems. We've got the we're running off of electricity, whatever it might be, so that we can plug and play and think about those things in the future. So I think that there are serious challenges to this spreading out as far if you have a one-size-fits-all solution to the energy source. So there's another question. Did you have
Yes, I would take that question, I guess, a step farther.
Mhm.
I look at the new conservatory, or whatever that building was, and say, really, you need that much glass, that much steel? It's certainly not locally, probably not locally available. And I wonder if we're taking this kind of concept to an absurd level. And if there's not a place where we say, okay, time out, let's see, let's think about the scale of these projects. And I like the neighborhood scale, but I see the possibilities in all of these scales. But I don't know, there's just, I guess it's just a question. I don't have the answer either.
You're kind of addressing the that there are a lot of challenges to. I don't look at LBC as being inhibiting per se. If you think about the possibilities of opening people's experiential qualities through the project, right? So that balance between the opening of windows and the closed, or the where the material's coming from. Well, I can't use that material because it doesn't come within this range, and I'm going to be mad about it.
Well, maybe just another challenge on that is, how much does it really make sense to bring the tropics to West Lafayette or wherever, Philadelphia or wherever? Do we
Not
have to have
Philadelphia.
all
They
of those
beat us
experiences
in
here?
hockey.
Can't we take people out into the woods and learn those? So it has a lot to do with programming too. What's this space for? And is it important to, I guess, why are we doing these things? If especially if it means living on Earth, living in place.
Yeah, well, sometimes the best building's no building, right? Like, that's the lowest footprint building that there is. And I think that if you have kind of asked yourself that question really significantly, and it still ends up that the building is an answer, or a tropical rainforest is an answer, then it becomes, your responsibility to figure out how to do that the best you can do it. So the funny thing is in telling you about a project, I won't tell you about the stuff that didn't happen in that project, because, for instance, there was to be a reception facilities and things like that, and that has to do with the economics of it, right? Because that's a money maker, things like that. But it's also a draw, and so they went back and said, well, could we do that somewhere else? Do we need to build that space? So what you see is a kind of pared down program already. But yeah, it's really important to ask is, do we need it as the first question, and could we do it some other way better? But it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. Yeah.
So I noticed that the form of energy that you were really concentrating on was solar energy. Would using two sources of energy, wind and solar, in combination, complement each other better?
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately on this site, there will be a little demonstration wind turbine. There's not enough resources. And like, how are you going to, if you have your building and two buildings next to you, and does everybody need a wind turbine in order to comply with living building challenge? Or should we be thinking district then? Are we looking at a larger issue? And so that's why the living building challenge is still really nascent. It's really early. Unfortunately, we didn't have other resources. We've got a river that's a mile away, that thing's got a very constant flow, but it's not ours to use right now. So I would like to have other opportunities to, to use in the projects that we do, but oftentimes that is the only one that is able to be implemented at an individual property scale, as opposed to, I mean, even geothermal, like geothermal makes a lot of sense if you can get to the right scale. But if you like right now you can't cross property lines, a geothermal system would be considered a public utility, and you can't cross property lines with that system necessarily. Well, that's inhibiting some really good solutions. But
What about for like a single dwelling, like the cabin at the Ross? Would a combination of energies be much
Yep.
better than relying on one?
absolutely, we're absolutely going to look at this. So when you think about where you're matching, like you have to do source and demand matching, right? So we're going to try to find out what our demands are when they come from, how frequent they are, what the spikes are, and then try to figure out where the resources are. And so tomorrow, that's what I'm looking forward to. And we have a couple ideas of possible things that could be sources of energy, and that's what we want to test with the group and see what people think. So. Anybody else? Yep.
Okay, so one thing that was talked about earlier this week was at one of the Earth Day events, the ecology of war, and they talked about the Jevons paradox. So with Living Building Challenge or just energy efficiency in general, how do we like either disprove that paradox? Because I don't necessarily think that it.
Can you tell me?
The Jevons paradox. So it's whenever you become more efficient, you end up using more
Okay,
energy.
Yeah.
So you showed some data about the building. This is what it would use. This is what it's using now. How do we either address that issue, or how do we disprove that that's still an issue, or even like a valid issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it that what we see in not necessarily Living Building Challenge projects, but other projects, is that our expectations of what a space is and what it does have gone up, right? So like, I mean, this happens all the time. You go into a home, you renovate it, and the room had a single light bulb in the middle, 100 watts, not very efficient, bad, right? And then you replace it with, at this point, you need like 15 LED fixtures that, yeah, they might sit more, but in the long term, they're using the same amount, right? So it's a tough question, because we expect in those cases that kind of lighting, that quality, is more appropriate or beneficial to what we consider the norm at that point. I think, I don't know if there's any designers in the field, I think that's the design challenge, is how to get stuff that satisfies these increasing levels of normative expectations, but still holds that level of energy use down. And part of it probably is just doing social norming. Like, you guys are probably familiar with VW's fun theory. Like, if you go on VW's website, Google VW fun theory, you'll see this set of stairs that look like a piano. It's coming out of a subway, and their question was, how do you get people not to take the escalator, right? Because an escalator is actually really high use energy. It's constantly running. So you make it fun. And so they made the stairs look like a piano, and they had, I forget, like 65% more people took the stairs when it was like that, right? So that's a design, it's a design problem. It's a system that somebody designed, but it's not a thing per se, right? It's not another product. It's a way of using it. And that's, I think, the future of, where design is going to go. We're designing systems, not just products. And so I think that's how we'll solve some of those things. We're going to rewire the way our social norms work, and we're going to rewire literally the stuff that we're making. So, any other questions? All right. Thank you.